Alrighty, so let's go ahead and get things rolling here. I mentioned this when I distributed the agenda for the meeting today. Our goal, we have it slated for 10 to noon. Our goal today, though, is to try to get you out of here a little bit earlier than we did last time. We went the full 2 hours at the last training. What I want today to focus on is allowing all of you to have a discussion and ask the questions that are going to help you all fulfill the specific needs of your local county coalition in terms of the work that we're going to be doing with this oral history initiative. So thank you again very much for being here today. It's a pleasure to see all of you. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, a recording of this training, this second training session, is going to be made available to all of you as well as to those who were not able to attend the meeting, and that will be distributed in the days following today's training session. This is, again, the second oral history training session for the Maryland Lynching Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Oral History Initiative. We're going to have a few structured segments to today's training session, and I'll be showing you all the agenda in a few minutes here. So we're going to have a few structured training segments. But again, my goal with this meeting is to provide you all a little bit more time to ask me questions, to have some discussion about your concerns, so we can get your questions answered in real time and again, get you out of here in a way that's a little bit more respectful of your time. From the outset, I want to reiterate that the work that we're doing with the Oral History Initiative is going to entail a significant amount of your energy, your solidarity, your trust, and above all else, a willingness to cultivate an interview space that is both safe and supportive for our interviewees. And throughout this process, right, both before the interviews are happening, during the interview, and also after the interview, it's going to require all of us to let go of ourselves a little bit, to practice selflessness, right? To be transparent with and readily available to our interviewees during the interview, to be listening more than we interject, and we'll be covering some of that today. And again, above all else, to allow the interviewee, rather than ourselves, to dictate their own narrative. So with all of this in mind, and we gave a little bit of a more in-depth overview of the goals of the initiative, the methodology of the initiative in the first training session. So if you're new today, I would recommend that you take a look at that past link to the previous training session. But with all of this in mind, again, we're asking you all to dedicate a lot of time, a lot of volunteer time to this work. And I know it's a lot, so I want to acknowledge that from the outset. And just begin by saying that if there are portions of this project that you and your coalition cannot commit to, please let us know, and we'd be happy to support you where needed, okay? So let's go ahead and begin by taking a look at the agenda for today, and we'll hop right in. Okay, hopefully everybody is able to see my screen. Can I just get a thumbs up if people are able to see it? Excellent, excellent. I'm going to do a quick zoom in so people can maybe see it a little bit easier. Okay, so let's take a look at our agenda for today. We're going to start first with a few updates that we have for you, particularly updates regarding some new documentation, updates to the workflow, which I will share in the chat in a moment, some updates regarding scheduling of the interviews as well. We'll then move into a quick recap of the more important topics that we covered from the first training session, namely working in their story. So we'll be doing a quick recap today of how we're all going to go about creating a Their Story account, and then preparing a session in Their Story, and also working within the interview space on Their Story. This is the platform, for those of you unfamiliar, that we will be conducting the interviews on. Following a quick recap of some of the more important points from the last training. We are going to listen to a pre-recorded interview that was very graciously put together by Linda Shopes. Linda Shopes is one of the members of the Baltimore County Coalition. She is also a distinguished oral historian who I have looked up to for a very long time. So she has some really, really wonderful pieces of advice to impart upon all of us regarding the art of interviewing. So actually, thinking about the ways in which we can make our interviews in real time as successful as possible. So she has some tips and techniques regarding how you're actually going to be conducting your interviews. Okay. And then following Linda's presentation, we will dive into an opportunity for questions and answers. And then I will briefly discuss with all of you some of the workflow items that are going to be helpful in terms of post-interview. Okay, so we'll cover some of the things that you all will be working on following the interview, and we'll also discuss in that section how us at the initiative can help you with some of these post-interview items. And then again, my goal is to offer a good chunk of time, hopefully 30 to 45 minutes toward the end, to just have a discussion, answer any questions you all might have, and sort of go from there. So with all of that in mind, let's go ahead and begin first with the workflow. So we covered this in detail at our last training session. I'm going to go ahead and put into the chat the link to the step-by-step workflow. This document, if all of you could open it up and sort of follow with me in real time. I'm also going to go ahead and share it on my screen. So sort of follow along however you would prefer. Give me one moment. Okay, so this document is our one-stop shop, right? Essentially for everything you all will need with regards to the oral history processes, right? The before interview, during the interview, and after interview processes. So you'll notice that there are links to relevant forms all throughout this document. I recommend that you all start here. As I mentioned in the email correspondence with you all, the shared Google Drive where all of the documents listed here are housed is a little bit disorganized. So I'd recommend that you stick with this document. It's very streamlined, very easy to follow. Okay. So like I said, we discussed in detail this workflow. So I don't want to spend too much time going over it again, but I do want to just take note of a few things that have been updated. And this is very much so a living document. So I'd recommend that all of you check this document as frequently as you can, maybe once a week or so, and just take note of some things that might be changing. But for the most part, every workflow item regarding the pre-interview process is ready to go. Okay. So you'll notice that we have this initial section with as soon as possible items. Again, reiterating from that last training, if you have not, as a coalition, gotten to these as soon as possible items, please, as the name denotes, do them as soon as you can. If you need help with anything here, feel free to reach out. The other thing I want to take note of is, since our last training, we have put together an initial outreach template, and that is linked here. This is a document that will be helpful for you all in terms of contacting your potential interviewees for the first time. The document is meant to be copied and pasted into an email. If your interviewee would prefer to speak with you over the phone, in person, you can also use this document as a rough script, just for how you're going to introduce the work of the initiative to your potential interviewees. That template also includes a link for your interviewees to complete their intake form and to schedule their interview. Okay, so again, everything in this workflow is designed to be as streamlined as possible. So you all don't have to go digging into our Google Drive to find what you need. Okay, so that's something new there. The other thing I would take note of as well is that we've added a few other outreach templates. And again, these are just going to be helpful for you all according to this timeline to be in constant communication with your interviewees. So this next template would be a template that we would use, to reach out to the interviewee to send them their interview guide, the release form, and the link to the interview space. There's another template that is a reminder template, right? Just to give interviewees a quick reminder that their interview is coming up in a week, so on and so forth, okay? But again, I would recommend that all of you on your own time, when you can make time, just take a moment to review this workflow. And please feel free to let me know if you have questions as you go through. And we'll sort of go from there. The other thing I wanted to take note of is that the informed consent and release form is finalized. That document is going to be very important in terms of ensuring that interviewees retain the copyright to their interview. It's a legal form, but it's designed to be in readable plain English. That document is now finalized. We've added a reference from Will Schwartz's suggestion to make sure that the Marilyn Lynching Memorial Project is actually named in the document. So that document is all set and ready to go and updated. The other thing I wanted to address, I've gotten a few questions from you all regarding the schedule of interviews. So let's really quickly do a review of the schedule. And I just want to make note of a few questions that I have gotten. So let me go ahead and put up on the screen the current schedule, okay? So this is our schedule of when the interviews are going to be taking place for each county coalition. And this schedule aligns closely with the public hearing schedule. So the idea here is that we would be conducting oral history interviews anywhere from a month to 2 months before the public hearings, so that we have time to process the interviews, develop the transcripts, and incorporate them as much as possible into the public hearings, into the narrative that you all are going to be putting on historical markers with the Equal Justice Initiative, those sorts of things. I want to reiterate, though, as I have in previous correspondence, this schedule is flexible. We can move things around. We already have, as you noticed, the schedule has changed since we first began working together. The other thing I want to take note of is that each county right now is designated either one weekend or 2 weekends to be conducting these interviews. You'll notice that all of these dates are weekend dates. The idea there is, first of all, we're presuming that a lot of you have full-time jobs during the week. So perhaps the weekend is going to be the most, the time that makes the most sense for you all to be doing these interviews. Likewise, these are the dates that the initiative is going to be able to provide counseling support, trauma-informed, culturally responsive counseling support to you all. But with that in mind, I want to also just clarify that you can absolutely schedule oral histories outside of these dates. You're not bound by these dates. The only thing that we would say is that we might not be able to guarantee on-call social workers if you schedule outside of these dates, but we are going to be able to provide some affordable, accessible alternatives. That is our goal, at least. So with that in mind, we have updated the booking page for interviewees. And again, this is all included on the workflow. And it is also included in that initial outreach template. But let me just show you the booking page for scheduling interviews. So when you send out your initial contact to potential interviewees according to that template, they will have a link in that email to this booking page that will allow them to schedule their own oral history interview. As we've noted in the past training, there's a lot of options that we're able to work with in terms of the type of interview that we want to set up. So all of the interviews we do will be conducted over their story. It can be a virtual interview, either over the computer or over the phone, or it can also be an in-person interview that would also be recorded using their story. What we've done here with this schedule, let's say your interviewee would like to do a virtual interview. We've taken note that we're going to try to keep the interviews to right around 2 hours. And I have opened up the schedule. Previously, the schedule only allowed interviewees to schedule their interviews on the days designated for their counties. What I've done is opened up the schedule to any day, essentially any time from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. that's going to work with the interviewee's schedule. And again, our preference is to try to schedule as many of our interviews as possible on those designated weekend dates, but we want to be flexible with both your schedule as interviewers and also the schedule of the interviewees. So this updated booking page allows people to schedule an interview during a time that works for them. Another thing I wanted to make note of is that when I receive a notification that an interviewee has scheduled their oral history interview, I will send that notification to you all. So let's say an interviewee with the Anne Arundel County Coalition schedules an interview. I will send that notification with the booking information to the facilitators, the interviewers, with the Anne Arundel County group, so that you all are kept apprised of your schedule. The other thing that I wanted to mention very briefly is that in the coming days, hopefully by next week is my goal, we will be distributing to you all a manual that summarizes, let me stop sharing my screen, that summarizes everything we've gone over in their story. So between the first training session and this training session, we've gone over a lot of the process of how to create an account in their story, prepare a session. We want to make sure that all of that is written down with some helpful pictures and a little manual of sorts so that you all can sort of follow along. So that's going to be put together in the next week or so. And then also we are going to be giving you all access to full-length examples of oral history interviews, just so that you can get a little bit of an idea of the flow of an interview. You can listen to the interview on your own time if you wish. And that way, again, you can sort of have an idea of what an oral history sounds like, the flow, so on and so forth, before you start doing interviews yourself. Okay. That is all the updates I have as of right now. And again, I will reiterate that I would recommend you all take a look at that workflow that I have linked in the chat. And that really contains just about everything you need in order to get things started on your end. Carol, looks like you have a question. I'd be happy to answer.
Yeah, I was just curious. I know we're using this platform to record our upcoming interviews. Mm-hmm. If you already have digital or video audio recordings of interviews, does this platform have the capability of uploading that, or do you have to only use this platform for your oral history projects?
Great question. Their story does, in fact, have you can upload pre-existing interviews to their story. The other thing we can do is we're going to be duplicating all of our their story files in the Google Drive, so we can also just add those pre-existing interviews to our shared Google Drive. But yes, their story does indeed have the capacity to, if you happen to have already done oral histories in the past, we can take those on. But of course, I want to say that you're not by any means required to share those oral histories with the initiative. We'd be happy to work to archive them and transcribe them if you all are willing, and if that's according to your wishes. But you're certainly not required to share with us and upload with us your existing oral history. So hopefully that helps. And when we get into their story in a moment here, I'll show you how that can be done. Any other questions, comments? Let me take a look at the chat. Amy is asking, will the actual hearings include in-person / live statements and or the oral histories that will have been collected in advance? Amy, great question. Both. The goal of the hearings is that, and Will might be able to speak to this a little bit better than I can, but the goal of the hearings is that we will have both in-person testimony from various parties, people involved with your local county coalition, from descendants themselves, hopefully. And then our goal is also to have some clips of these oral histories that we can work into the public hearings as well. Will, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, that's
okay.
That captures it. Thank you.
Great, sure. All right, so let's go ahead and really quickly do a review of how to use their story, because this is beyond the workflow, what you're going to be working with the most. So let's take a look at their story. And again, in that workflow, in the as soon as possible section, you will see instructions for how to create an account on their story. When you create an account and add your email address, create your own password, you will be added to their story. And from there, hopefully everybody is able to see my screen with their story. Can I get a thumbs up? People can see that. Great. Once you create an account on their story, this is what you will see. You will see the landing page for our initiative for the Lynching Memorial Project. And from there, what I will do is I will make sure that each of you are added to the applicable county group that you're associated with. So in the My Group section, you'll see that we have created individual groups for each county, and you will be added to the group that you belong to. This is our landing page, the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, right? And this is, again, that initial landing page. Don't worry too much about this page. The other page I wanted to alert you all to is if you go to My Groups and select the MLMP/Their Story tutorials, you will notice that there are some tutorial videos from Zach Ellis, the founder and CEO of Their Story. Some of these tutorials are a little bit more helpful than others. I would recommend taking a look at this one. This will be a little bit more applicable to the post-interview process that we'll be talking about later. But if you're interested in some tutorials beyond what I have already given to you all, feel free to navigate to this section here, the Their Story tutorial section. When you all create a Their Story account and you're beginning to schedule your interviews, you have some interviewees lined up, you're going to want to go ahead and hit the Their Story icon. And from here, you have two options to get your interview space created. If you have a scheduled Their Story interview in advance that is not in person, right? So if you're going to be doing an interview over the computer, over the phone, you're going to want to hit the Prepare a Session button. And we went over this at the first recording, or rather the first training, but a quick recap. You're going to want to add a title that aligns with the title framework that is in the workflow. And that framework is very simple. It's oral history interview, followed by the name of the interviewee. So let's say you're interviewing someone named Jane Smith. You want to make sure their name is what follows, and then in parentheses, the county that is associated, right? So for example, I'm from Carroll County, I will add Carroll County, okay? And this is, again, this title guidance is in the workflow. So just take a look there. After that, what type of recording? You're going to want to hit one-on-one or group call. This is what will differentiate between a live recording and an asynchronous recording. In almost every case, we're going to be doing a live recording. Okay, so you're going to want to hit one-on-one or group call. We talked about this last time, and I want to return to this very briefly because I had some concerns brought up about this. When you are preparing an interview in advance, right? So let's say for me, today is August 14th. I have an interview planned for August 20th, 6 days from now. And I know that I'm going to be the sole interviewer, and I'm going to be working with one other interviewee, right? You are going to want to select, in that case, just the interviewee is displayed. So what that will do is when we get a final recording of your interview, only the face of the interviewee is going to be showed to us. Because honestly, our faces are not terribly important. We will be able to hear in the recording us, the interviewer, asking questions, but we want the focus to be on the interviewee. Something that's really important to note here, though, is that their story, when you create the link and we'll get to that in a moment, when you create the link on their story that you're going to share with your interviewee, just like you would a Zoom link, right? You'll email them the link so they can come into the interview space. Their story is going to assume that the first person who opens up that link is your interviewee. So if you're only sending the link to one person, selecting just the interviewee option is perfect. However, if, for example, you're going to be interviewing one other interviewee, but somebody else from your county is going to hop on the call and maybe also ask some questions alongside you. So in that case, the link would be sent to 3 people, right, in total. You're going to want to make sure if there are more than just 2 people involved on the call, that you're selecting that everyone is displayed. What might happen if you accidentally select just the interviewee, if you're having more than 2 people on the call, is that, for example, let's say I send a link to one of my colleagues at the Carroll County Coalition, and I also send the link to the interviewee. If my colleague from the Carroll County Coalition opens up the link before the interviewee, their story, in the case that I select just the interviewee, might mistake my colleague as the interviewee, and we're only going to see the face of my colleague as opposed to the interviewee. Okay, so again, just to reiterate, when you're selecting display of final recording, if it's just going to be a one-on-one interview, right, between yourself and one other person, you're good to go to select just the interviewee. If their story interview is going to involve more than 2 people, make sure you select the everyone is displayed option, just as a safeguard. So we'll hit continue. From here, you do not have to worry about this section, as I mentioned earlier in the first training, because we will be having our own questions set up in advance. You'll hit continue. From here, you're going to want to select your applicable county, right? So I'll go ahead and select Carroll County. Don't worry about the high def recordings, just hit continue. Hit continue again, nothing to worry about here. And then once again, nothing to worry about here, hit the create session. And from here, you'll see that your interview session is ready to go. And this is, just like I mentioned, functioning exactly like Zoom. So you have a prepared, scheduled in advance session. And you can now share the link with your interviewee. So you'll hit copy link. And then this is the link that you will put into your correspondence with your interviewee to make sure they have access to the interview space. Okay. Another thing I want to show you all, and I want to again clarify this. If you are doing an in-person interview, I know for some of the county groups, that is going to be a more convenient option, particularly if interviewees are not as tech savvy. That's perfectly fine. If they're not comfortable on the computer, not comfortable on the phone, that's okay. In that case, what you'll do is you will still record over their story. You bring your computer to the in-person space, of course, keeping in mind COVID-19 guidance from the CDC, preferably making sure that both parties are vaccinated in advance. Both parties have agreed to conduct an in-person interview. You'll bring your computer to the interview space. And the easiest thing to do from there is, rather than preparing a session in advance, because you don't need to send a link to somebody in that case, because you'll just be bringing your computer, what you can do is log into their story and simply select launch a session. From there, you'll be immediately brought in to the interview space, and you'll be able to start the recording just like you would in a Zoom session. Okay. I also want to point out that this screen is exactly the same screen as this button down here in the launch. So if you've prepared a session in advance, the way you get into your interview space is to hit launch, right? So let's say that scheduled interview that I had for August 20th, it's 10 minutes before our scheduled time. I'm logging on in advance, I hit the launch button. So this is your interview space. And like I mentioned to you all, this works just like Zoom. So currently I haven't hit the recording button You're able to chat with your interviewee, get acquainted with yourselves a little bit, check in with your interviewee. And then once you all are ready to begin the recording and start going through your interview guide, you will go ahead and hit this all important button, the start recording button. Make sure you hit this button because it does not automatically start recording. You have to hit the start recording button. Okay. Once you are done recording, you will hit the stop recording button again and then the hang up button. The other important thing in this interview space is the invite others button. This button will allow you to share with your interviewee in this dialog box an option for them to phone in to the interview. So let's say your interviewee is not comfortable on the computer. This would give them an opportunity to simply dial in with their phone. You can send them this phone number and this code for them to dial in, okay? So that is the very brief review of what we covered at our last training. And what I'd like to get into now is Linda Shope's presentation. Her presentation is going to very briefly cover some recommendations that she has for protocols to follow before your interview. The bulk of her presentation is going to cover some tips about how to make your interview as successful as possible. Let me take a quick look at the chat here, see if there are any questions I can answer. Okay, Amy is asking, does each coalition create a single account or does each interviewer create their own? You're going to make sure if you have multiple interviewers that each interviewer is creating their own account. Because again, what you don't want to happen is for their story to be misidentifying who's the interviewer, who's the interviewee, so on and so forth. So make sure if you have more than one person from your coalition who might be conducting interviews, each person is creating a their story account. We have an unlimited amount of people that can be added to their story. So good question there, Amy. Pam is asking, does interviewee also have to have a computer or will both be using the interviewer's computer? Pam, I'm assuming this is in reference to a virtual interview. In that case, like I mentioned, not necessarily. So their story is able to also accommodate dial-ins, so phone calls into the interview, just like Zoom. If you're doing an in-person interview, you will only need one computer from the interviewer. You will bring your computer to the interview space. You will set up your camera just like I have it set up so that it's able to see both of your faces sitting in the same room, and you will hit the launch a session button and go from there. Hopefully that answered your question, Pam. So no, you don't necessarily, the interviewee does not need to be tech savvy. They do not necessarily need to have a computer. We can accommodate if they don't. Amy asked, if in person, would our computer face the interviewee for visual purposes? Yes, just like I said, you want to make sure that if you're setting up in an in-person space, there's a little bit of distance, right? So you might set yourself up here facing the interviewee, your interviewer would be here, and you'd just be having a conversation, okay?
So Jack, can I follow up with that? That definitely, your sound quality dropped drastically when you moved away from your computer. So,
good point. So,
I mean, does it make, I guess we can figure it out, but in my mind, I'm thinking that my computer should face the person being interviewed to capture as much sound quality about them. I don't need to be on the computer visually. That way I can continue to face the person being interviewed and maintain eye contact, etc., which seems much more important, eye contact and sound quality, as opposed to what you just suggested. I don't want to overrule it, but, you know.
No, I agree with you completely.
Okay, it just was really startling how much your sound quality dropped.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Two options there. You can either do what you suggest, which is rather than having both of you in the picture from a distance, have the interviewee here in my place answering your questions. The other option is that the initiative is able to provide microphones for in-person interviews. So in that case, you'd be able to connect two microphones to the computer, and you could have people at a distance with the microphone on their shirt. And in that case, the sound quality would not be interfered with. So it's really, yeah, it's up to you. But absolutely, if you don't want to bother with setting up microphones and so on and so forth for an in-person interview, definitely just have the interviewee set themselves up nice and close to the computer. And like I mentioned earlier, the focus should be on them. Carol asks if this functions, so if their story functions like Zoom, if there are multiple people, is the interviewer able to set the screen view to presenter mode so that the interviewee ends up as the only person spotlighted in the final recording? Good question, Carol. So when somebody is speaking, let's say you've set it so that multiple people are on the call. When somebody is speaking, their story will automatically detect who's speaking and will make them the focus, which is a really nice and helpful feature. And then Carol also asked, do you edit the final interview recording or is it used as recorded with all the technical things going on to set up and facilitate the interview? So this is something that that we will cover in a little bit of detail here in the latter part of the training. But long story short, unless there are like major problems that occur, the final interview recording is going to be just as is. We're not going to make too many changes. Again, even if there are some technical issues, there's really not too much need to edit those things out. We want people to see sort of the natural progression of the interview, but obviously you're not gonna start recording right while you're setting things up and so on and so forth. But to answer your question, we're not going to be worried too much about editing that recording again, unless there are major problems that need to be addressed. Okay, so I want to go ahead and get on to Linda Shope's portion of this presentation. This is about 30 minutes. And she notes in the beginning of her presentation that you all are welcome to add some questions as they come up, just like you've been doing already. She's going to be making a presentation. Feel free during her presentation to add your questions in the chat. We will also have an opportunity toward the end of her presentation to do an in-person Q&A with me. I'll do my best to address things. But if some of your questions from her presentation do not get answered, we will, just as we have in the past, make sure that your questions get answered over email in the coming days. Okay, so let me go ahead and get her her presentation here, ready to go. Okay, can everybody see this PowerPoint presentation that says oral history interviewing? Thumbs up. Excellent. All right, we have about 30 minutes of Linda's presentation. I may pause on occasion just to add some context to some of the things she's saying. Again, this is a pre-recorded interview, so Linda was not able to join us today, but she very graciously was willing to lend her expertise. So many thanks to Linda for sharing with us her experience doing oral histories, which I should note is far more extensive than my experience. So I'm very appreciative for some of the advice that she's going to impart upon all of us. So let's go ahead and take a listen.
Good morning. This is Linda Shopes. Thanks so much to Jack Del Nunzio and the Maryland Lynching, Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Oral History Initiative for inviting me to talk with you for a few minutes about the art of interviewing. I regret that I'm unable to be here live, but please feel free to post any questions you may have in the chat. I'll ask Jack to forward the chat to me, and I'll get back to you with my responses. Also, I'm happy to address any questions or concerns as they come up. When you begin interviewing, you can email them to me, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, at lshopes@aol.com. And Jack, if you could post my email address in the chat too, that would be good. One thing really is certain, questions will come up as you face the unique encounter that is an oral history interview. So, two features, I think, underlie everything we might say about an oral history interview. First, an interview is grounded in a relationship. The quality of an interview is related to the quality of the relationship that the project, and especially the interviewer, establish with the narrator. This means recognizing and acknowledging the value of a person's participation in the interview. It means creating an environment of respect and trust, and defining the interview as a serious and thoughtful exploration of the topic at hand. It also means taking full account of the narrator's interests and needs throughout the interviewing process. Cultivating this kind of a relationship begins well before anyone starts recording an interview and extends into the actual interview. The second key feature of oral history is the need for flexibility throughout the interviewing process. The Maryland Lynching Oral History Initiative has outlined a very thorough process for doing an interview according to high standards of the craft. But every narrator is unique, with unique experiences and a unique way of speaking about them. Every interview has a unique dynamic and flow, requiring creativity and common sense every step of the way. So using these notions of relationship and flexibility as a framework, in the next few minutes, I'd like to outline some procedures and tips for preparing and then doing an interview. In fact, you will spend more time preparing for an interview than actually doing it. The Maryland Lynching Initiative workflow document identifies several steps to take before actually undertaking an interview. These include first, sending a potential narrator an introductory letter or email. Then, once you have secured their willingness to be interviewed, doing background research. Then having what we in oral history call a pre-interview, conducting a pre-interview with the narrator prior to the scheduled interview. And finally, preparing an interview outline tailored to the narrator. All are part of cultivating a relationship with the narrator. Now let me go over these a little more in detail. The introductory letter or email is essential, for it lays out the significance and purpose of the project, the value of the person's participation, the topics of the interview, and what will happen to the interview once it is completed, including ownership. This first communication should emphasize the narrator's control over the entire interview process. It gives the narrator all the information they need to give what we call informed consent to the interview, or to decide that they don't want to participate. This initiative has not yet produced a template introductory letter, but when it does, I emphasize, put it in your own words. Templates can be stiff. Make this letter sound like you. You want to make clear the seriousness of the interview, but not turn a person off with undue formality.
Hi, everybody. This is Jack really quick, just giving a little bit of context here. That introductory letter template has been added to the workflow since Linda recorded this presentation about a week and a half ago now. And to Linda's point, please feel free to make changes to that template to reflect your own voice. As with the interview guide templates with some questions there, and Linda will get to that shortly. These are just templates. So I invite you all to please make changes, and as Linda says, to inject your own voice into those templates. Let's continue listening.
The next act of preparation is background research, which we do so that we can put a given narrator's account of the lynching under discussion in context, so that we, as an interviewer, can demonstrate respect by asking informed questions. So read all you can, not only about the specific lynching you're interviewing about, but also the local and national context. Now, I know that research can be, like going down a rabbit hole, and you're going to have to put some limits on it, but do as much as you can before the interview. And then before the interview, we have a pre-interview conversation. Most fundamentally, to deepen rapport with the narrator and to establish a certain level of interpersonal comfort. This conversation is also an opportunity to review with the narrator the particular protocols of this oral history initiative, how the interview is going to proceed. Again, to ensure that they give their informed consent to the interview. This is the time in the pre-interview to explain the Creative Commons licensing agreement they'll be asked to sign. During the pre-interview, you'll also want to get some basic biographical information. The initiative has prepared an interview intake form in the Google file or folder that you should have access to that asks for some of this. At the end, it provides space for the narrator to add information about themselves. Here is where I would note the information the interview templates ask for in the biography section, where the narrator was born, their racial and ethnic background, gender, education level, relationship status, children, and occupation. I would put it in this intake form. I would not wait until the interview itself to ask for this information, because you don't want to spend the first critical minutes of the interview getting this routine sort of information. It sets up an interrogatory dynamic and a pattern of short answers. Instead, you can use this information gathered ahead of time to frame more open-ended questions. For example, I recall when we spoke before, you telling me you were born in Towson. Tell me about your family as you were growing up there. Instead of, where were you born? When were you born? You know that ahead of time and can use it to frame a question. So you've done the pre-interview. Now you need to prepare an outline for the interview tailored to the specific narrator. The interview guides prepared by the Oral History Initiative include numerous excellent questions. Cumulatively, this is going to give focus and coherence to the entire project. Review the guidelines several times, study them, understand what they're trying to get at. But you'll notice that I said prepare an outline for the interview. Don't create a list of questions. Create an outline of topics and subtopics based on the lines of inquiry from the interview template appropriate to this particular narrator. For a 1-hour interview, I would say 4 to 6 topics with multiple subtopics or ways into the topic. And I should say that the template suggests many more possible lines of questioning than you could possibly pursue in an hour, and I think even in a 2-hour interview. So why do I say don't prepare a list of questions? Because that's going to limit you. You'll tend to proceed down the list of questions rather than follow the narrator's lead and listen carefully. In fact, a narrator may answer question 10 as part of their answer to question 3. An outline allows you to map out the interview while also allowing you to adjust and detour more nimbly when they cover something you thought you were going to ask about later at the beginning of the interview. Also, if you send questions to a narrator in advance, they're likely to prepare answers in advance, again, obviating the sort of expansive, open-ended recall you want to encourage. But I should say that it's important that you let them know the topics of the interview in advance, the general topics, so they won't be caught off guard. They need to know what they're going to be asked about, especially for something as sensitive and difficult as a lynching. As you review your outline, think of multiple questions to ask for each topic and subtopic, referring again to the very thorough template. But phrase the questions when you're thinking of them and asking them out loud to yourself and asking them in the interview. Phrase them in your own words, in everyday English. Don't rely on the template's wordings. The language is a bit academic, I think. And of course, you will bring the outline to the interview. So let's turn now to the actual interview.
Hi again, everybody. This is Jack. I just want to talk a little bit about some of the points, the very excellent points that Linda brings up here, for some of the suggestions as to how we should be proceeding before the interview. The first thing I want to discuss very briefly is her point about using the templates that we have sent you all that contain many different options for interview questions. To Linda's point, the goal of these templates is to provide plenty of opportunities for you all to pull from these templates what you would like. You certainly do not need to include all of the questions that we have on the template for each of your interviews. As Linda says, it probably would not be realistic. But the idea with these questions is a lot of them get at some of those missing pieces of the lynching narrative, particularly the Black perspective on lynchings that is at the core of this initiative. So to Linda's point, certainly do not feel like you need to be posing all of the questions that are on the template. Another point that she raised was with regards to creating an outline. And I would agree with her there that especially for each of you, it might be useful for you to think in the specific context of your county, of your interviewee, right? Your specific interviewee, and of the specific case of racial terror lynching. It might be very helpful for you to take a few minutes to develop an outline with topics and subtopics that you want to cover in the interview, and then develop a few questions in your own words that align with those topics. At the same time, I would say that this is an optional exercise. You all are already being asked to do a lot with this initiative. If you feel like this would be a helpful exercise for you all in the context of your own counties, in the context of your own interviews, please feel free to do so. And just like I said, pull whatever you would like from these templates. One last thing that Linda brought up is the notion of whether we should be sharing in advance with interviewees the interview questions. And Linda suggests that perhaps we simply share the topics of the interview in advance. I'm going to defer to you all on that decision. I trust you all to make a decision that you think makes sense. But what I would say is that it is a traditionally in the field of oral history, questions are not shared in advance. To Linda's point, the idea there is to try to get as natural of a reaction, as natural of an answer from interviewees as possible as soon as you pose that question. However, one of the core parts of this initiative is transparency and developing trust with interviewees. And I think in particular, when we are discussing these traumatic, very sensitive topics surrounding the topic of racial terror lynching, it is appropriate to alert, especially descendants of some of these victims of racial terror lynching, the type of questions that we're going to be asking them and ensuring that they feel comfortable answering those questions. And if they don't feel comfortable, rather than having to have that confrontation in the middle of the interview, you can have that discussion before the interview. So again, I'm going to defer to all of you to make the decision that works best for your county, for your specific interviewees. But Linda certainly raises some very good points here. So let's continue listening and let's get some of her strategies for during an interview.
Recall that I said that a narrator, each narrator is unique, and each interview has its own unique dynamic. Well, the same is true for interviewers. Each interviewer is unique, and each of you is going to have your own particular style of interviewing. I wish I could give you a surefire set of techniques and tips and strategies for doing an interview, but I can't. Only by doing interviews, gaining a certain comfort with the act of interviewing, learning your own particular style, critiquing your work, and learning from your errors, and we'll all make errors. Only by doing this will you become a skilled interviewer. But again, the key to a good interview is to continue to develop the relationship you have begun with the narrator and to remain flexible throughout. A good interview is more a matter of solid preparation, sincere curiosity, and good social skills, listening skills, and knowing how to draw a person out, than a matter of specific technique. Alessandro Portelli, who was a well-known Italian oral historian, says there are only two rules for interviewing: good manners, in other words, respect for the narrator, and telling the truth. That is transparency about what you're doing. And I once heard the novelist Jennifer Egan talk about doing interviews as background for one of her books. Asked what essential lessons she learned about oral history from doing these interviews, and she came to them with a more interrogative style as a journalist. She said what she learned was to be quiet and listen. They'll get to it. They'll get to what you're looking for. They'll get to answer your questions. Be quiet and listen. Good advice, I think. Our job as an interviewer, I maintain, is to imaginatively enter into the mental world of a narrator, to try to see things from their perspective, and to frame questions that try to draw that out. The best interviewers listen carefully to what is being said and what is between the lines of what is being said. Some refer to this as a process of deep listening, in which the interviewer is fully attentive to what the narrator is saying without trying to control it or judge it. A good interviewer encourages a narrator to remember details, works to clarify what's unclear, evokes retrospective assessments, and supports in general a narrator's effort to think deeply and richly by asking creative questions, all in a low-key and respectful way.
Very quickly for you all, what Linda is saying here is that you will do a lot of preparation before your interview in terms of developing a relationship with the interviewee, and also preparing your own interview guide that will serve to create some structure to your interview, right? So your list of questions, your list of topics and subtopics, many of which are already listed on those templates that have been provided to you all. What Linda is saying is that while all of that preparation is very important and it's going to ground your interview, it's also important to be listening actively to your narrator, to your interviewee. So don't have your eyes peeled on your questions and have a set order necessarily in place. That order might switch around according to what your interviewee is saying in real time. So if they start talking about something that you didn't expect them to talk about, ask them why, ask them some follow-up questions, and be willing to go a little bit off script. That is a really important part of the interview process. So let's continue listening.
While I can't give you techniques that can be imposed on every interview situation, I can suggest now some strategies that can deepen the relationship with the narrator and draw their story out. So it might be useful here to consider the arc of an oral history interview. At the beginning, you start with questions about the narrator's background, and this is on the templates. Even for very topically focused interviews like ours, it's good to establish a bit of biographical context. And as I say, these are nicely outlined for you on the interview guide templates. But be aware of what I have detected as a perhaps positive or nostalgic bias in some of the suggested questions. For example, the template suggests asking about special days or events or traditions from your childhood. And after finishing high school, what did you do? That's another question to suggest. Well, not everyone has had special events in their childhood. And I don't think we should assume that every person has finished high school. So maybe instead ask about memorable events. And maybe saying, after finishing school, what did you do? These first few minutes at the beginning of an interview are sometimes going to feel a little awkward or uncomfortable as you negotiate what, after all, is a pretty peculiar social interaction that we term an oral history interview. So you'll want to ease into it. Typically, within about 20 minutes, the interviewer and the narrator settle in and, we hope, develop a comfortable exchange. Now, from these biographical questions, you move to the body of the interview, where a person's personal biography intersects with the topic at hand, in this case, clearly a lynching. A lecture on oral history that I listened to some time ago identified 3 types of questions. Informational questions, that is, what happened? Empathetic questions, what did you feel about what happened? How was it for you? And critical questions, how do you explain what happened? Now, don't limit these critical or evaluative questions to scholar interviews. Regular people may very well, and often do, have quite thoughtful things to say about lynching and racial injustice in general. Give them the opportunity to say it. Now, the final stage in the arc of an interview is the denouement, or the winding down. Here you ask summative kinds of questions. As you think about the lynching of so-and-so, what especially stands out for you? What lessons would you like people to take from your interview? Or for someone listening to this interview 100 years from now, what thoughts would you like to leave with them? Now, throughout the interview, you clearly need to be sensitive to the narrator's energy level and their emotional state, particularly given the topic of the interview. You know, you can stop and ask them how they're doing, if they'd like to continue, to pause for a break or stop and continue at another time, if that's possible. And if their emotions are running high, if they might want some support from a social worker. There's no problem with interrupting the flow of questions by, pausing and checking in. So now let me give you some specific or some general strategies for interviewing. So open each topic on your outline. Remember, you come prepared with an outline, not a list of questions. Open each topic with a broad, open-ended question. One good approach is what's called the 2-sentence format. The first sentence sets the stage, the second sentence asks the question. So, we've been talking about your own background. I'd like to move now into some questions about your ancestor that was lynched. Tell me, what do you know about the circumstances of his lynching? Tell me about is an especially good way, I think, of opening a question. It gives a lot of latitude and it's also open-ended. Follow up the initial open-ended question with questions that probe the topic more fully. The details and clarify anything that is vague or unclear. How did you first learn about this lynching? What was your reaction to learning about it? And so on. Probe one topic before going on to the next. I would say that in the hundreds, really, of interviews that I've listened to, failure to follow up on a topic
I'm not sure if everyone can hear me. It looks like we're having a little bit of technical difficulties here. Let me see if I can refresh this page. Sorry about that. Give me one moment here.
each topic with a broad, open-ended question.
Okay, sorry about that, folks. Let's get back to Linda's presentation. Let me share my screen. Okay, everybody able to see her PowerPoint again? Great, sorry about that, folks. Let's get back into it.
One good approach is what's called the two-sentence format. The first sentence sets the stage, the second sentence asks the question. So, we've been talking about your own background. I'd like to move now into some questions about your ancestor that was lynched. Tell me, what do you know about the circumstances of his lynching? Tell me about is an especially good way, I think, of opening a question. It gives a lot of latitude and it's also open-ended. Follow up the initial open-ended question with questions that probe the topic more fully. The details and clarify anything that is vague or unclear. How did you first learn about this lynching? What was your reaction to learning about it? And so on. Probe one topic before going on to the next. I would say that in the hundreds, really, of interviews that I've listened to, failure to follow up on a topic is perhaps the single biggest problem with especially, but novice interviewers, but interviewers in general. I would say fewer topics in depth are better than many topics covered superficially, but you have to gauge, how much to spend on one topic and when to move to the next. Remember, flexibility. Listen deeply, trying to discern what is between the lines of what a person is saying and draw that out. What do you mean by he was a hard worker? Or we always tried to get along. Listen also with what we call the third ear, the ear of a potential user of the interview. What might they need to know to understand more fully what the narrator is saying, what someone listening, indeed 100 years from now, might want to know. Ask about it. Create a slow pace. Pause between questions. Appreciate the value of silence. Silence is our friend, as a way for a person to take in a question and deal with the painful subject. You may be anxious for one reason or another. Monitor your own reactions to something being said. React supportively, but not forcefully or judgmentally in a way that crowds out the narrator's own emotion. And curb a tendency to rush in with the next question to cover up anxiety. Let the narrative itself breathe. Feel free to follow up on something the narrator says that's not part of your original outline, but is potentially fruitful. Remember, flexibility is key. Related to this, interviewers often worry about what to do if a narrator veers off onto a tangent that's not pertinent. I'd like to say gently get them back on course, but in fact, most interviewers let them go because you never know what might come up. Something that it turns out is quite pertinent to the topic. Remember what Jennifer Egan said, be quiet and listen. Whatever you do, don't interrupt a narrator. That sets up a really bad dynamic, contrary to encouraging amplitude in recall. If you don't understand something, jot it down and then follow up. Likewise, interviewers worry, especially in interviews of the sorts we're doing, what to do if the narrator becomes overcome with emotion. Unless you are a therapist, don't try to play one. You can do more harm than good. I advise responding as you would to anyone in an emotional state, with kindness and understanding. Give the narrator a moment. Ask if they'd like a break, or if they need to end the interview. You can always go back, or maybe you can't. It's their choice. Mostly, people are going to collect themselves pretty quickly. They entered into the interview knowing what it was about. They have a reason for putting what they know on the record. Don't dishonor them by precipitously ending the interview. But of course, again, if they do need to stop, by all means do so. You know, I think about interviews that I've seen and listened to with Holocaust survivors, certainly very painful memories. And yet people choose to do these interviews because they want to leave a record. And in fact, most report feeling, I don't know, lighter after the interview. So that's something to keep in mind. And now, just some specific tips. Avoid leading questions like, isn't it true that, or do you think that? These are questions that imply the answer. It implies the answer you want, not their answer. Avoid either or questions also, which delimit a narrator's response to one of two options, when in fact there may be something different altogether that's their answer. Avoid questions that put words into a narrator's mouth. So then I guess you, or you must have felt. Don't tell them what they did or how they felt. Ask them. But don't confuse a leading question with a direct question. A leading question leads the narrator to the answer. A direct question focuses the inquiry on a specific topic, but does not imply how the narrator should answer. People sometimes think that merely bringing up a topic, often a difficult topic, is leading the narrator. But leading people to a topic isn't the same as leading them to the answer. Try to get questions, brief and to the point. But don't worry about perfect phrasing. It's okay to fumble for words or to express your own puzzlement. You know, I'm not sure how to phrase this, but what I think I'd like to ask, or where I think what I'm thinking about is, ask one question at a time. If you ask more than one, the narrator will almost invariably answer the last question. If you don't understand something they're saying, as I said, don't interrupt. Wait till the narrator finishes and then ask for clarification. Again, you want to set up an expansive pace where the narrator doesn't feel rushed or like they're doing it wrong. Make a note on your outline about something they've said that you want to follow up on, and then do it. Often people make reference to a person like Bill. Well, Bill who? Or the park, what park? And you don't know what they're talking about, nor will anyone else listening to the interview. So do try to get clarification. Just wait until the narrator has finished speaking and then ask, well, you mentioned Bill, who was this person? And what was his last name? If a narrator asks you a question, answer it, but answer it briefly. Don't turn the interview into a chat sharing your experiences and views. In general, I counsel interviewers to adopt a low-key, friendly, but professional stance. You can appropriately share about yourself and your views in a pre-interview or after the interview. But during the interview, try to keep the conversation focused on the narrator. Try to avoid social noises like, yes, okay. They muddy the sound and tend to make it hard to hear what a narrator is saying on a recording. Try to affirm what a person is saying non-verbally by nodding, by smiling. Well, this doesn't mean that you're an automaton and can't react when they say something that merits a reaction.
Very quickly, this is a great point from Linda, and I just want to make sure it's clear. When you're doing your interviews over their story, your interviewee will be able to see your face, even though it will not necessarily show up on the final recording. So to Linda's point, things like saying, yes, try to avoid those audio affirmations, but certainly if somebody is explaining something to you and you want to nod or smile, show some visual recognition of what they're saying, please feel free, and they'll be able to see that as you're doing the interview over their story.
So I do say, if you are a particularly reactive person, as I am, tamp it down. You don't want your own emotionality or the force of your own reaction to overtake the narrator. If you find the narrator seems to be resisting or avoiding answering a particular line of question, stop. If it seems appropriate, go back to it later when the narrator is perhaps a bit more comfortable, and think about multiple ways into a given line of inquiry. But again, use your judgment. If it feels like you're pressing too hard on something that you sense is not that the interviewee doesn't want to talk about, leave it alone. It's all right. Remember, flexibility. Every interview involves judgment calls by both the interviewer and the interviewee. Judgments about what question to ask at this particular moment, and also about how to answer it, about when to press forward, when to pull back, about when you have explored a topic enough and when it's time to explore some more. Given that a person's experience is nearly infinite, you can't really capture everything. There's always more to ask. So be strategic as you move through your outline and pace the interview. I'm not going to say anything about after the interview. The project has well-developed protocols for after the interview, and so I'll leave it to Jack and others to address these issues either today or at some other point. So thank you very much for your good attention, and don't forget to put questions in the chat, or you can email me at lshopes@aol.com. Thank you so very much. Bye.
Okay, I wanted to once again thank Linda Shopes very much for that excellent presentation that she put together for us. Hopefully you all found that helpful. I think she has a lot of really great experience to impart upon us. I certainly found it helpful, particularly her discussion of some of our expectations that we should have as to how the interview itself is going to play out in real time. And hopefully you all took away some helpful tips and strategies for how to be conducting yourselves during the interview. There was a comment in the chat asking if this slide deck could be shared, and I will certainly make sure to get the slides from Linda. And when I send out the follow-up email to this training session, in addition to the recording of this training, which will include her full presentation, I'll also attach the slides separately so you all can have access to them. And hopefully that'll prove helpful. Also, to Linda's point, at this time, if you all have questions about her presentation, I can either try my best to address them. You can unmute yourself and ask. You are also welcome to put them in the chat, or you can email Linda at the email address provided, lshopes@aol.com. I'll go ahead and put that back in the chat again. Please feel free to direct questions to Linda. She is very available, very accessible, and I'm sure she would be happy to help, particularly any questions you might still have about the how the interview itself will unfold. Does anybody have anything pressing that they wanted to pose before we very briefly address some of what will happen after the interviews are done?
I have a question. This is Gail Raisin from Kent County. Sherilyn Eiffel talked to us about how it came about that she wrote her book. She sent her law students down to Salisbury to interview people, and she told us about how some people claimed that they witnessed events that they clearly could not because they weren't alive. And I think she attributed it to trauma. And I think we all know memory's not reliable, and people often recount witnessing events they haven't. If that happens during an interview, what should the interviewer do?
It's a great question. What I would suggest in that case is that unless it is something egregious, insulting, or offensive, there is no need to make a correction. Part of what we are sort of getting at with these interviews is just to your point that memory is not perfect. It is changeable. And that is something that we can sort of parse through a little bit after some of these interviews are done. But again, unless it is something that really needs to be corrected for the sake of various reasons, let's say that somebody, regurgitates a white supremacist narrative about a lynching, you can respectfully add some context during the interview. But if they, for example, misstate a date, or, to your point, if they're claiming that they witnessed something that perhaps it's not really possible they could have witnessed, let's listen and perhaps ask a follow-up question that might help put things into context a little bit. But to the point of Linda's presentation, our best approach is going to be to listen and allow people to speak their story as they understand it. Hopefully that's helpful. Carol, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on that. In our work in Baltimore County with historian Louis Diggs, who has actually done a lot of oral history interviews of his own 30 years ago of elders, and his respect for the intentional silence of many of the people he was interviewing because they did not want to approach talking about the topic. So I just wanted to reiterate that you may find that, and it's okay not to push them on those topics, but that we are also getting a perspective of them as a person, as a whole, and not just about their narrative related to the lynching. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Carol. It's a very important point. Absolutely. The way that the templates have been designed when you all have a chance to review them is to make sure that there is space in the first hour or so of the interview for the narrator to explain their story on their own terms, so that we are paying respect to them as a person, as a human being, first and foremost, and then moving into some questions about the specific narrative of lynching once we've established some of that rapport. And to your point, Carol, absolutely, there will be silences, there will be moments of discomfort, there might be, to Gail's point, discrepancies that arise during the interview. But again, unless they are really, really egregious or offensive, I don't see a need to correct them. We want to let that record stand as it is in the narrator's own words. Anything else that anybody wanted to ask or comment on before we move on? Okay, with that, I very briefly, no more than 10 minutes, want to address what is going to happen after the interviews. And I want to stress that what I'm about to share with you all is entirely optional because you are already being asked to do a lot. And I, at the beginning, reiterated that any of these pre-interview processes that you and your coalition are not comfortable or perhaps do not have the time to dedicate to take on, myself and my colleagues at the initiative are happy to lend assistance there. And likewise, a lot of these post-interview processes are very, very time consuming. The development of a transcript, the development of an index, working to get all of these materials archived properly, they are time consuming and sometimes very, very stressful. So I want to reiterate that a lot of this is optional. If you are particularly tethered to your interview and you really want to be the one that works on the transcript, please feel free. But if you would prefer that somebody from the initiative handles this work, we are happy to take that on your behalf. So let's go ahead and quickly go through the workflow. And then I'll also share with you on their story what a lot of this will look like. So let's take a look. Let me get myself situated here. Let's take a look at the workflow. And I've updated this last section of the workflow a little bit in the past few days. Okay, workflow is up on the screen. We're looking at this initial box here that is the immediately after the interview, and I've highlighted, I've bolded here that these are important processes, but again, you all are not required to do them. I am able to go into their story and do all of this work on my own. So again, if you all are not going to be able to volunteer your time to do a lot of these steps, that is perfectly fine. But let's talk really quick about what's going to happen after your interview. After your interview, there's going to be essentially three main things that need to happen. There's going to be maintaining communication with the interviewee, thanking them, right? So making sure we reach out to them, and that's listed here using this post-interview thanks template. Again, it's a template. Feel free to put things into your own words, but we want to make sure we're being appreciative of the time that our interviewees have given to us. So that's one thing. Another thing is making sure that we have metadata and duplication of files, and we're going to go through that very shortly here. The other thing that we want to be thinking about longer term is the archiving aspect, and that's largely going to be our responsibility as the initiative. We already have pre-existing contact with the Maryland State Archives, with Maryland's 4 HBCUs, and with the Mitchell Program's Digital Museum, which is where these interviews are going to be housed and made available to the public. So that is going to be on us, the archiving aspect. The other thing I wanted to say on the archiving front is that I've had some counties ask if it would be possible for these interviews to be archived on a local level, right? If you have a local historical society, perhaps a church group that might want to archive these interviews and make them available, we can absolutely accommodate that and make that possible as well, okay? Let's talk very briefly about their story and what it will look like once you get out of an interview session. So let me go ahead and adjust my screen here. Okay, so if you all recall, remember I was telling you when you're in your interview session, you want to make sure you hit the start recording button, go through your interview according to a lot of the great tips and strategies that Linda just provided us. And then once you're done with your recording, you will hit that stop recording button and the red icon with a little phone indicator on it that says hang up. Once you hit that hang up button, this is exactly what you will see on your screen. You will see, this is just an example that I made without the camera on, but you will see the face of your interviewee and the finished video recording. And then what their story is asking you for here is some metadata. And what the metadata allows us to do is just identify important aspects of the interview, right? So we give the interview a title, we give the interview a brief description, you can add optional tags, and likewise, you want to make sure you're selecting your appropriate county. And then at the very end, all importantly, you want to make sure you are selecting save story. Make sure you do not hit this red delete story button. And all of the information for how to input metadata is attached to the workflow. Let me show you all. Again, the workflow is your one stop for everything. It's all there. When you look at the workflow, you'll see here, follow the post-interview instructions document. You'll hit that. Let me make sure you all can see this new document. And this document that's linked in the workflow gives you some of the filler here for the metadata that we just looked at, right? How to enter participants, the template for the title, description template. Again, reiterate, these are templates. You don't have to follow it exactly, but we do want to try to have a little bit of standardization here, okay? And then importantly, again, make sure you're selecting the Save Story button. Let's go back to their story. And let's just very briefly here see what will happen when we hit that Save Story button. So I recommend that this metadata is something you want to do right after your interview. It takes no more than 5 minutes. You want to be doing this while it is fresh on your mind, okay? Especially with regards to the description and adding tags if you would like. I mentioned in the document that tags are completely optional. So once you've filled in your metadata, you'll hit Save Story. And from there, it's going to bring you to a screen that gives you a few options. So here's your saved story. This is just a template. This is not an actual interview that I did. It's just an example template. But we want to then move on to making sure that we have properly duplicated these files. So in the case that something really crazy happens and their story accidentally deletes the interview, or somebody else, accesses their story, somebody from your coalition obviously accesses their story and accidentally hits the delete button, something like that happens, we want to make sure we're taking steps to have duplicates of all of these files. And we're going to be moving those to our shared Google Drive. Also in that document, the post-interview document that again is on the workflow, it gives very detailed instructions as to what we will be naming these files. Really important that we have some amount of standardization here, okay? So there's going to be a list of files that we're going to develop for each interview, and I'll go through these very briefly. You're going to have 2 files of the actual interview itself. The first will be an MP4 file, and that will be the combined video and audio file. It's going to be a large file, a few gigabytes in size. The second interview file is what's called a .wav file, and that is just the interview audio. So no video, just the audio of you interacting. We want to have both of those. Again, just as a safeguard. And you have the formatting here for the files, and I've listed some examples of what that file will look like when you name it down underneath, okay? You're also going to be working on transcribing if you would like. Again, everything I'm sharing with you all right now is optional. If you do not have the time to work on metadata, to work on transcribing, to name all of these files, that is something that us at the initiative can handle. But for those of you who are interested in doing this work, maybe have some spare time and you want to give it a try, this is for you. So let's continue. We're going to have a transcription file. Once that file is finalized, you'll go ahead and name it appropriately, okay? You'll also have that interview guide that you will have developed beforehand. We'll want to preserve that interview guide. Likewise, your informed consent and release form, you will want to make sure that we have the signed version of that form from the interviewee. Photographs. This is something that was brought up at the first training, and it's a good point to emphasize. Luckily, because we're using their story, in almost every case, we will have the interviewee directly on the screen, right? So in most cases, we are not going to need to ask an interviewee to take a photograph of themselves, or we would have to capture one of them. In the case that, let's say something goes wrong with their story and you're doing an in-person interview, your computer stops working, something is just not working properly, your internet's cutting out, so on and so forth. In the workflow, there's a detailed explanation of how we make sure we account for some of those problems that might come up. And in that case, you would bring along with you, always bring along with you for an in-person interview, a backup recording device, whether that's your phone, or the initiative can also provide professional recording devices by request. So if you all know you're going to be doing in-person interviews, please make sure you let me know and I can get you recording devices. In that case, right, in the case that you're going to have to use one of those backup devices and you're not going to be able to capture video of the interviewee, you would want to ask for a photograph or take a photograph while you're in the interview space together for an in-person interview. So here's the file naming guidelines for that. And then finally, also, we're going to want to make sure we retain hard copies of the original and the signed release forms. Just for our record, we'll make copies as well for the interviewee for their records. Okay. Let me take a look at the chat here. And then I'm going to show you what all of that will look like on their story. Yes. Thank you, Amy. Amy was asking if I could remind you where their story produces a draft transcript. We're going to get into that right now. So let's take a look. So I was showing you all every single file that we're going to produce from an interview. Now we're going to take a look at how that happens in their story. Okay, so we're back on their story. We're back to our finished interview. And there's a few different buttons down here that we want to be aware of. The first is the edit button. This button will allow you or me or anybody from the initiative to go back and change that initial metadata that you get as soon as your interview is finished at any time. Okay, so like I was saying, if you have time to do this metadata, great. If you don't, and you want to just leave all of this blank, you totally can. You just want to, again, make sure you scroll down and hit the Save Story button. But the great thing is you can go back and edit this. Myself, my colleagues from the initiative can go back and edit this at any time. So that's what your edit button does. Another few buttons here that we want to be keeping in mind. The Share/Export button. This is where you're going to get your video recording. That includes the audio and the video. So this is your MP4 file listed on that spreadsheet. You're going to want to make sure you hit Share Export, navigate to Download, and then hit Video Recording. I want to again warn you all, this is going to be a large file. This is going to be anywhere from 3 to 4 gigabytes. Again, everything I'm explaining to you is optional. So if you're not comfortable downloading that large of a file to your computer and then uploading it to Google Drive, just let me know. We'd be happy to do that as well. Okay. This is where you're going to find your MP4 video recording. Okay. The next thing that we discussed was that WAV file, just the audio. That's here, Export WAV. By clicking that, it'll automatically download a smaller file that is just the audio. The next button, to the point that was brought up in the chat, is your transcription. So when you first create your interview, you're going to want to hit the auto transcribe button, select English, but note that there are other options just in case we need to use them. It'll take, especially for a full length interview, it might take 20 to 30 minutes for their story to work through its transcription process. Because like I said at the first training, it does a fairly good job of getting us a rough transcript. Once their story has finished with the transcription, you'll notice that auto transcribe changes to edit transcription. You'll go ahead and click that. Let me make sure you all can see this new screen. And this will be your transcription page. I covered in at least 10 to 15 minutes of detail at the first training session how to use various different keys on your keyboard to navigate this transcription page. Long story short, this is all editable, right? You can edit, delete, change, make adjustments to language, especially because your transcription that you get from their story is not going to be perfect. You are going to have to go back through and make some changes to punctuation, to spelling, especially proper names, those sorts of things. But you can edit all of this in their story. And again, I'd recommend that you go back to the first recording. The link for the first recording is in the workflow, and more explanation as to how to use this transcription tool, if you would like, is in that first recording. In order to download the recording, you're going to want to find this transcript export options button at the top right. You'll hit that. You're going to want to go ahead and select the Word document option, and then you'll download it and use that file naming standard that was on the document. Okay. The other thing that we very briefly mentioned at the first training is the possibility to add an index. So in addition to your transcript, which will be a word for word recounting of exactly what was said in the interview, you can also develop an index. And think of an index as a table of contents in a book, right? There are specific sections that you want to outline in your index. The indexing standards that we are going to be using are outlined in the tutorial that is already uploaded on our shared Their Story account. There's a whole, it's about a 7-8 minute long video that's up by Zach Ellis, the founder and CEO of Their Story. And he gives a really nice brief overview as to how to use this index. And what I would tell you all to do is, if you're interested in developing an index for your interviews, take a look at his video, and let me show you where that is. Give me one moment here. So again, if you recall, when you're on Their Story, you'll go ahead and find the My Groups tab. You want to scroll down to the section that says MLMP/Their Story tutorials. When you hit that tab, there'll be a selection of some helpful tutorial videos that Zach has posted. And one of them is creating an index using Their Story. So it's a 7-minute video. Follow along with some of the very helpful suggestions that he has. And when you're developing your index sections, you want them to reflect the topics and subtopics that are on your interview guide. And like I said, the templates are already on the workflow. Let me just show you that really quickly. So when you're developing your index, again, you want to be selecting and creating little pieces of your table of contents that reflects your interview guide. So here's an example of an interview guide. This is the Descendant interview template that we talked about at the last training. So you'll notice beyond the objectives that there's a section here that begins the interview with introductory statements. So on your index, your very first headline, you'll want to have introductory statements, okay? Once you get through in the interview, all of these formalities that the script is highlighting here, then there's this biography section. So you want to make a second index heading that says biography section. Again, using that tutorial that Zach has graciously provided for us. So again, you want to make sure your index sections, just like a table of contents, are sort of pointing to what is in your interview guide so that people can follow along. The other thing you can feel free to do in the index is highlight specific sections where the interviewee makes note of something really significant. Like if they're pointing out a new piece of information that we have not previously known about a case of racial terror lynching, you might point that out in the index. And again, the tutorial to do that is on our Their Story page through that video that Zach provided. Okay. So those are the two main post-interview items, is transcribing and indexing. I should say, actually, the two main ones are duplicating files and transcribing. Indexing is helpful, but not necessary. And again, it's something that we are happy to help with. In fact, all of the things I just described to you are optional. Myself and my colleagues at the initiative are happy to take those on, again, especially because we are already asking you all to do a lot. The last thing I will say, and then we'll take some questions and wrap up, is feel free, if you would like, to take a look at some of the other items on the workflow that are detailed. You scroll down to the right section, that are detailed in the next sections. Again, all optional. A lot of these items are going to be done by us at the initiative, but there are some points here that you can feel free to take on if you all would like. If you have established relationships with your interviewees and you would like to be the one to send them all of their edited materials from their interview for their approval, you can absolutely do that. Again, we're also happy to do it, but if you would be more comfortable doing that outreach, you can do that. There also is linked here a final materials checklist that, again, if you want to work through, you're welcome to. And then finally, again, this making sure everything is archived properly at the identified repositories is largely something that we will be taking on as the initiative. So once again, I would recommend that you all stick to this workflow. It has really just about everything you need. And it's that one-stop shop for the pre-interview, during the interview, and post-interview processes that are going to be really important to making sure that we're doing this work correctly and respectfully, and in a very transparent manner, making sure that we are developing relationships first and foremost, and establishing a level of support and safety for our interviewees. So take a look at the workflow on your own time. And with that, we have about 9 minutes left. So let's go ahead, and I'm happy to take questions about anything. It can be about the presentation today. It can be about anything related to the initiative. Please feel free to shoot. Anything that you do not get to post to me in real time, please put in the chat. Send me a quick email, and we'll make sure to address. Linda, go ahead. I see your hand up.
Oh, sure. I know Carol had a question in the chat too. Regarding the safety and support for the interviewees, someone said to me that some people may be fearful of retaliation. And so I noticed there's a possibility for people to use a pseudonym on the Common Agreements signature page. My question would be, would they sign their real name? And then how would they do the interview? Would it be an audio if they didn't want to have their face shown? And if they would be fearful of someone detecting their voice, how would that work for someone who would want that option?
Great question. So in the case, yes, in the case that somebody would like to be referred to with a pseudonym, we would have them sign with the pseudonym on the informed consent. We would not have them sign anywhere their real name. And likewise, Zach Ellis, the founder of Their Story, has alerted me to a new feature that allows us to muddle the without losing sound quality, which is important. We're able to change and alter the voice to make sure that they're not identifiable. So that's a great new feature that he's worked on. And it's a great question. But yeah, we have options in place there. And that's actually a good point. It's something that I might add to the informed consent agreement, another byline there, just giving interviewees that option to also have their voice altered if they would like. So thank you for bringing that up, Linda. We do have that in place. Carol has a question from the chat. she's saying, as partners through Marilyn Lynching Memorial Project, are we able to utilize the Their Story resources and platform to support community-based oral history projects beyond the scope of these interviews specifically for this project? What happens when this project is done? Good question. So Will might be able to shine some more light onto this. I know we have a current subscription with Their Story. I'm not certain how long it lasts. I know it at least lasts through January, which are the last public hearings. Will, are you aware of the length of our subscription?
So, yeah, so actually the subscriptions are staggered a little bit. Ours started in July, that ours being the Marilyn Lynching Memorial Project. But the way this is set up is that the John Mitchell Justice Program and the Marilyn Lynching Memorial Project are each basically contributing this subscription to this effort, which is that we're involved in now, that's in support of the commission, the Maryland Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Each subscription is limited to a certain number of interviews that run through this thing. So I would say for the time being, that is the primary focus for using these, which isn't to say that when we get to the end of the road, depending on what's left in the tank, that they couldn't be used for other reasons. But I would say at this moment, these are for the commission, for the Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
I thank you for that clarification, though, because that actually gives us additional framework as far as how many interviews should we be considering. Because if there's a limitation, then we should be factoring that into how many people we reach out to. And also that this is basically the tool and the resource to quickly get the interviews and the transcripts, but then it is processed to their archival, wherever they will be archived. And so I appreciate understanding that part of the after product.
Sure. And then, when we get to that point, we may decide, even though we're done with the interviews for this purpose, if the tool is useful enough to for everyone, there's no reason why we couldn't continue.
It seems like a great resource, huh? So I'm excited about it.
Yeah.
So thanks.
Sure.
Will, just a quick follow-up, and it's okay if you're not sure. Do you happen to know the limit that we have on the amount of interviews?
I want to say 100.
Okay.
But that's per year. And so it can be renewed. So, and my expectation is that it would be renewed. So.
Is that 100 for Marilyn Lynching Memorial Project, or is 100 per county?
I think it's 100
For the
total per year. But I got to check with Charles on that. But that's my understanding. I'd have to go back and look it up.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Will. I think 100 sounds, to be frank, about right. My sense thus far is that there are going to be some counties that are doing over 10 interviews, certainly, but I think the vast majority of counties are going to be doing anywhere from 3 to 5, at least from the initial intake forms that I've been receiving. But we can, as you say, we'll make adjustments if we need to. If we're finding that, wow, we're going to be doing a lot more interviews than we might have expected, we can make those adjustments in real time. Anything else that I can help with? Any clarification? Any more questions? Okay. Well, if that's the case, let's go ahead and call this a day on our second training session. It was once again such a pleasure to speak with all of you, and thank you for attending. This, like I mentioned at the beginning, will be made available as a recording for you all to have for future reference. We'll also be sending this out and making sure it's available to any of your colleagues from the various counties who were not available to attend today. And we will be in close touch with updates, with new documentation that might be of help to you all. And again, I want to say that as we start to get these interviews scheduled, as those go through the booking page, I will be sending to you all the intake information so that we can remain on the same page. and feel free to reach out to me, to Will. I'll go ahead and put the official initiative email address in the chat, but feel free to reach out if there are parts of this that just feel overwhelming and you would like any of our help with. Okay, let me go ahead and put that really quickly in the chat. But thank you again, everybody, for attending.